Hi, I'm Mimi Chan. Welcome to Culture Chat. Thanks for joining the conversation. Hi, everyone. In this episode, Greg and I discuss book-to-film adaptations. It was fascinating to learn why certain elements in a book don't make it on the screen from a screenwriter's perspective. Greg dissects the ins and outs of certain film adaptations and how translating a book can be very tricky. We talk about some of our favorites and discuss some listener suggestions. We discuss characters and books like Batman, Pride and Prejudice, The Lord of the Rings, Sin City, and The Princess Bride. Greg also shares some insights about his recent screenplay, The Old Guard. If you haven't seen it yet, do so now. It's available on Netflix, starring an amazing cast including Charlize Theron, Kiki Layne, and Chiwetel Ejiofor. We'd also love to hear some listener feedback and questions, so send them in if you have them. We also discuss DC's recent distribution decision to cut ties from Diamond Comics distribution. For those that don't already know, Greg Rucka is a New York Times best-selling author of hundreds of comics and nearly 24 novels. I'm loving these conversations and hope you are too. If you are, please rate my podcast and share it with others. Finally, if you'd like to support with a donation, you can become a patron of the show by visiting my website or patreon.com. I would certainly appreciate it. For comments or suggestions, email me at mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or reach out on social media at SifuMimiChan. Now, on with the show. Hello, Greg Rucka.
Hi, Mimi. How are you?
I'm great because it's another week with you.
Oh, the things you say.
Well, I thought today would be kind of fun if we've been asking our listeners to give us some thoughts on book to film adaptations. And it's something that you and I have touched on in the past, and kind of a nice departure from the heavy stuff that we often get into. So
Right. So we'll see how long this lasts.
Of course, because naturally we usually take a turn down a dark alley, and then that's where we find ourselves, and that's quite all right. So we had some
I guess just as a general, I don't feel that we. It's not as if we go looking for the dark alleys. We're living in July. Today's July 2nd of 2020, and unless you are really willfully and actively living with your head in the same, unless you're doing a full ostrich.
Yes, full ostrich.
You got to be aware, guys.
No, it's true.
So,
it's true. Yeah, we just tend to get so heavy, and I think that's a good thing, and our listeners actually have really enjoyed that and enjoyed the conversation. But it is, like we said previously as well, a nice departure even for us to watch something that doesn't evoke strong emotions, and that is just for entertainment.
Doesn't require nightmare.
Yeah, and of course here I am, over the weekend watching, because I just finished reading Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy, so of course I had to watch the film Just Mercy, and I'm telling you, I'm keeping it light, whereas I didn't exactly keep it light, but great.
I was going to say, how's that going?
But I also watched
working out for you.
Yeah, but I also watched, to balance it out, Scott Pilgrim versus the World, which I'd never seen, so that was light.
It is. That's a hoot. That was a hoot.
Yeah.
It is definitely a hoot.
Yeah. So, and that is a comic book to film adaptation, which is pretty spot on from my recollection. Yeah.
I mean, look, when we're talking about comic to film adaptations, like in the broad main of it, one of the things that I think we have to talk about at the front is whether it is an attempt to translate, meaning to literally take the text and moment for moment, beat for beat, everything in the book goes into the movie. Or if it is an adaptation, which is to say, is it a work that, meaning the adapted version, is it an attempt to take the heart and soul of the source material and to translate that, right? So that there are sequences in certain books or moments in certain books where if you say, well, we are doing a version of The Lord of the Rings, for instance, then when you have the Fellowship of the Rings, if you do not have a moment where Gandalf is standing on the bridge opposite the Balrog and saying, you shall not pass, you have failed. No, I mean, you have literally failed. You have,
because that's the essence of
you have taken one of the most iconic moments in the story, and you haven't moved it over, right? Another example would be you have to do, again, sticking with Tolkien, if you're doing The Hobbit, you have to do the first meeting between Bilbo and Gollum as it is written, right? It is one of the most iconic scenes in fantasy literature, is that riddle game. And if that is absent, or if it is not tonally correct, then the rest of the work is going to collapse, at least for the people who are coming to it from the source material. That said, and in particular in comics, there are things that will not translate. And I say this as the guy who, and we're getting ahead of ourselves a bit, but this is going to come out just before the movie, so I don't think this is of issue. There's a change in the Old Guard, right? And the Old Guard is a pretty tight adaptation. When Skydance got it, and they said, yes, you can do the screenplay. They said, this is the thing we want. We want this story. There is a sequence in like the second or third issue of the Old Guard, in Opening Fire, where Andy has brought Niall to meet the team in Paris, and they have arrived at the Paris safe house to find that everybody's gone except for Booker. Mm-hmm. And Andy realizes that the team that has taken Joe and Nikki is coming back. Right. And that sequence in the comic is this stairwell fight, right? It's mm-hmm. Andy descending 5 stories on the stairs as these, commando shooters come running up. And in my first couple drafts of the screenplay, that was what I wrote. I wrote a version of that. It wasn't beat for beat it, but it mm-hmm. that was the location, that was the setup, and that was Andy has to fight her way down and into the lobby and out. Mm-hmm. And then Charlize Theron came aboard to play Andy and pointed out, not incorrectly, that she had in recent memory done a movie that had, and what is probably the most iconic or memorable sequence in the movie is her character descending a flight of stairs and moving through these apartment buildings fighting.
Is that the Atomic Blonde?
Yeah, it's from Atomic Blonde. And so that note very directly was, this has to change. Right. I don't want to be doing the same thing again. Even if this is different, it looks it looks at first blush at least the same. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So look, that is a non-damaging, non-invasive, ultimately inconsequential change. Does the fight do we set this in a location, or are we going to set this instead in an abandoned church? And the result of that change in the movie is that there's a location that we spend some time in the movie that absolutely doesn't exist in any of the comics. It's a fantastic location. It's one of those locations where if I had known about it, I probably would have used it in the comic. Right? It does no harm to the source mm-hmm. material. And arguably actually improves it in certain ways. There's some metaphorical and thematic stuff that comes about as a result. So like I said, when we talk about adaptation of a novel or a comic or whatever to the screen, I think it's very important to, and I've said this multiple times because I've been doing this electronic press junket.
Of course.
Right? So this has come up, but the nice thing about always the nice thing about talking with you, Mimi, aside from it being you, is that it's not in 3-minute bits, so I can elaborate on it. I think mm-hmm. I think it's important that we understand our terms and that we go into these things I was going to say with our expectations adjusted, but I don't think that's what I mean. What I think I actually mean is we have to acknowledge fundamentally that a novel is never going to be a movie, is never going to be, a comic. These are different animals. And if you go into one expecting it to be the other, you are more than likely going to be disappointed.
Yeah. I mean, that's what we normally hear, like, oh, it wasn't as good as the book. And then I think you had told me a while back, someone was like, well, no, oh, you ruined my book. And they're like, no, my book's right here. It's
there's
that story
Raymond,
you shared.
It's the Raymond Chandler story. And I'll
Right.
give you an example of what I think, and I know this may be blasphemous to some comics fans. I don't think Sin City is a good movie. I think Sin City is a technically accomplished achievement.
Okay.
All right. But any movie that you go to and the first comment that people have when you leave is, oh my God, the whites on the screen were so white and the blacks were so black. It's like, okay, so, a admirable job was done in recreating Frank Miller's visuals from the comic. But I would argue, right, Miller wrote a comic, not a movie. And God almighty, there are lines of dialogue in that movie that under no circumstances should ever have been spoken aloud. No. In all sincerity, they are internal monologue lines that when you read them yourself, you can take the sting off of the cliche of the line.
Right.
But when somebody says to somebody else, you're 40 years old and you got a bum ticker, it is really hard to ask an actor to deliver that with a straight face. And you're asking a lot of the audience not to go, and snort. And it's not that it is it's not that the attempt isn't admirable. Visually, it's wonderful, right?
Yeah.
But a movie is more than the visuals. I had a professor at Vassar, oh my God, 30 years ago now, who one of our first assignments was to adapt something from a novel. It was like find a novel that you like or whatnot and just adapt the scene. And the example he used, and I remember watching it, was the Robert Redford, Mia Farrow, Great Gatsby. And the scene he showed was the scene when you first meet Daisy.
Okay.
And it's a pretty sequence. It's well shot. It absolutely fails to capture what Fitzgerald is doing in the language because you can't. There's a description of Daisy's laugh before you see her rising up like a balloon. Right? How do you shoot that on film?
Right.
You can't do that. So going in, right, you have to acknowledge what the strengths and the limitations are of the mediums. So.
Yeah. Oh, wow. So going back to Sin City, that's really interesting because I'm usually really picky when it comes to watching film, with my small film background. And I have like qualms all the time.
Yeah.
But in terms of that one, I don't think my expectation was like, okay, this is going to be an amazing film, quote unquote, cinematic feat, but I enjoyed the direct translation because I thought it was different than anything else in terms of comic book to film adaptations, right? So, and you're saying exactly that, right? So an adaptation is where you take, as long as like the essence of the character is preserved, the truth of these characters and maybe the story that's told is there. And a lot of times we see really big liberties taken, which like just kind of usually ruin the thing. But I liked the fact that it was a little corny and that it was just literally watching it come to life. So from that aspect, I really enjoyed it. But now, of course, now that you pointed out, if I were to go watch it again, then these things would bother me.
Well, here's the difference, right?
Yeah.
Miller in the comics, I think, is not writing pastiche. And I don't know Frank Miller, and I don't know what he would say to it. But I suspect that Sin City is born out of a love of noir and of pulp.
Yeah.
And it takes itself deathly seriously.
Mm-hmm.
All right? It really does. I mean, you cannot you can't read those comics and look at the art and look at the stylization of it and go, there is a tongue in cheek here. Okay,
Right.
fine. I accept that reading the book. When you have Miho, Deadly Little Miho, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a character on screen, it's absolutely parody. It is self-parody. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that the movie in and of itself is a bad movie. It's an exceptionally well-made film.
Yeah.
It is a technically accomplished film, right? And again, as a translation, one can argue it succeeds.
Mm-hmm.
My question is whether or not it needed to be translated. In that instance, right? Because film does different things than a comic does.
Yeah.
And I'm more than happy to admit it's a minority opinion. But I come out of that movie going, this is an attempt to make this love letter to what Miller has created, and instead it's come out as sort of a parody of it.
Okay.
That's
interesting.
And I find it's a very hard movie for me to watch and not go, they are parodying not just Miller unintentionally, but the whole genre. And the other thing is things that were mildly problematic on the page. And there's a lot that is problematic in Sin City. It's the nature of the material.
Right.
Becomes really problematic when you ask actors to do it.
Mm-hmm. For example,
Miho is
Miho's
the immediate one, but the lack of agency of the women, the hypersexualization of them,
right.
I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So and again, this is not me saying I dislike Sin City. I love those books, right? And I can see them for what they are. I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think they are. I don't think they're Miller's best works, but I think they are some of his boldest works. Mm-hmm. For many years. So it becomes an interesting tension of what an adaptation is meant to serve, and where it may succeed or fail. There was a television series out of the UK about 30 odd years ago. This was how Sean Bean sort of came to be Sean Bean, which was called Sharp's Rifles. It's based on a series by a writer named Bernard Cornwell. And when I saw these, they came to the US via Masterpiece Theater. And they're about a soldier in Wellington's army in the Napoleonic era, basically. And I was just taken by this series. I thought it was fantastic. So I went and I read the books. And the episodes are, titled after all the novels. And it's one of those cases where you're like, oh, okay, this one was a direct adaptation. This, they just used the title. It's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I've been watching a lot of the old David Suchet, Hercule Poirot's with Jen at night. That's sort of a wind down because they're safe and innocuous. And you watch Suchet's Poirot, and it is as loving and devoted a portrayal of a literary character as Jeremy Brett's Sherlock Holmes, for instance. They are very serious about getting the character right.
Yeah. They
don't really give a rat's ass on a lot of these early ones about correct adaptations of the stories.
Yeah, and I think that's a personal opinion as well, like whether it's like, well, as long as the essence of the character is there versus a story. Whereas, one of our audience members was like, talk about Lord of the Rings, talk about Pride and Prejudice. And for me, Pride and Prejudice is something that my husband would say I'm a little obsessed with, like many people, right? But the thing is, recently did kind of listen to the book and everything, and there's been so many adaptations, and that's, I think, a story in which if you don't get the story right and you don't get the characters right, people are going to be in
Yeah,
just an uproar, unless it's like Pride and Prejudice and zombies. Like, it's
zombies, right?
supposed to be
Yeah,
different, right?
and when you
But with
say at the top,
yes, it's we're not trying to do
yeah,
the film. So when they like take something that's kind of more classic like that, it's definitively a problem. And I hadn't watched the 2015 in a long time, and of course, since our audience member threw that out there, I'm like, I don't mind watching it again. And then I enjoyed it, but then I realized there was just, to me, there was like a lot of things that were kind of missing, because the thing I like about Austen is the characters she develops, and then the wit in which she executes her how she speaks,
yeah,
and how witty they are, and it's like very well crafted. I think even more so than, like, she's not a, what I would say, like, descriptive writer, right? She just kind of like, here's the scene, here's what's happening, and then, Elizabeth Bennet gives him these lines. And so I feel like in the 2015 there's sometimes a lack of that execution,
mhm,
but it's much more beautifully shot. It's like really modern, everything was really beautiful, whereas the BBC miniseries, I actually think, did such a good job of interpreting the book that it's better than reading the
right.
book, dare I say, listeners.
Well,
And I mean, there's several key points that I could go through and why that is,
uh-huh,
but like, you can write like, oh, Lizzie came to Darcy's sister's help, but like in the way they show it in the miniseries, there's just like this amazing like sexual tension growing, and how he sees how wonderful she is, and you could just there's just such a difference in the energy and the chemistry there.
uh-huh,
And it's written very like 2 or 3 sentences, but in the miniseries, there's so much that is founded upon that.
right.
So I have to say, I really actually enjoyed the miniseries
Well,
better than the book.
and now you're talking about a couple of things, right? You're talking about
Yeah.
you're talking about a work that is so beloved. All right. So
Yeah.
you don't want to get that wrong. You're talking about the difference between being able to do in 12 hours, for instance,
Right.
something that in a motion picture they're trying to do in 2 to 2.5 to 3.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see the immediate problems.
Mm-hmm.
The less time you have on screen, the more efficient
Yeah.
you're going to have to move.
Yeah.
And there are going to have to be sacrifices. You're going to have to
Yes.
decide, well, this isn't going to work. To Kill a
Yeah.
Mockingbird, and we talked about this a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
We we lose Jem and Scout's summer away,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That whole sequence is not in the movie. Now, one can argue it isn't needed for the film, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is instead it is a sequence that is about their growth and their relationship, and for the plot of the book, it doesn't it doesn't forward the plot, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a period where the case with Tom is not moving forward, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the movie needs to focus, the centerpieces is Tom's trial.
Mm-hmm.
I think the movie of To Kill a Mockingbird is a fantastic adaptation.
Yeah.
I mean,
I agree.
I absolutely adore it.
Yeah. I agree.
It captures the heart and soul of the book. So,
Mm-hmm.
does every beat need to be there? We talk about, I've never read the books and I've never watched the series, but you can hear Game of Thrones fans,
Mm-hmm.
talking about what was correct
Yes.
in quotes because it was in the books, and what is incorrect because it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And I never have heard, and again, I speak from gross ignorance here, but I have never heard anybody say in the series' defense, well, that wouldn't have worked on television. You couldn't have done that, right? That maybe some of these changes were made because this is a different medium. I write, all the Kodiak novels are first-person novels.
Yeah.
If we ever do a Kodiak series, the last thing I want is a first person narration. I don't want a voiceover, right?
Yeah, it changes the whole tone of the film and the feeling
Exactly.
of being able of watching it. Like as a reader, it works.
Yeah.
I think Bird Box was another one. I didn't read it, but my husband did, and he was like, "Oh my gosh, this was an amazing book." But the whole premise is she's blindfolded and she hears all these sounds. But when
Right.
you're watching that, you don't get that same
Yeah.
like feeling, right? You're just kind of seeing her like run away from things, and it's not the same as when you're reading it and you're imagining that
Yeah.
that's you.
And-
It's
and
a
it's
different
a-
experience.
and
So that first person narrative
yeah,
changes
you're
things.
taking a movie that is films are visual,
Mm-hmm.
and you have just removed the primary component of why you watch a film. So you change it. That's not to say you never show somebody who is blindfolded, right? But you have a very different experience when you are watching somebody knowing that they cannot see and they are fumbling around. That's called suspense, right?
Yeah.
And it's a very different thing if you're sitting in a darkened theater watching nothing and trying to
Yeah.
make out what's going on solely through sound. And that's not to say that that latter version isn't a worthwhile endeavor. You might be able to
Yeah.
create something brilliant, but let's be honest about what a movie is,
Yes.
and whether or not, for instance, that wouldn't work better as an audio drama, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so going back to Lord of the Rings, because that was one of the suggestions from one of our audience members. Like, I will be the first to admit I did not read those. Or if I did, it was like really a long time ago. But I know that they're in kind of your recollection in terms of the adaptation. I mean, obviously there was some key moments that were there, but do you feel overall? I mean, he also did it in 3 very long films, so he
Yeah.
had a lot of room to make sure the important parts were there. But it seemed like a pretty good adaptation from
Well,
what I've heard, but I didn't read them.
I think it is, but I am not the most religious Tolkienite that you're ever going to meet.
Like Stephen Colbert, for example.
Yeah, no, I am not fluent in any of the Elvish tongues, and I am not somebody who can cite, excuse me, chapter and verse of the Silmarillion. But I do think as movies, and frankly, in that, look, if you're a diehard, I think there are things in those movies that you look at and you go like, well, they failed in that, or they dropped that, or that and for instance, the absence of the scouring of the Shire, one can argue, undermines the overall message, sort of what Tolkien is writing about. At the same point, another 40-minute sequence at the end of Return of the King probably would have led to mass revolt. And in a movie, and in that movie, what the story of the trilogy in film is primarily Frodo's story.
Mm-hmm.
And Frodo's story ends at a very certain point. That's what the film was building to. It's Frodo and it's Sam.
Mm-hmm.
And they both need to hit a resolve. And it's a cinematic resolve. I never saw those movies and was like, I am bitterly disappointed by them.
Yeah. I remember enjoying them.
Yeah. I mean, but I also had friends who just hated them and weren't fans of Tolkien.
Okay.
Like they didn't know the books. And
Okay.
came out of the first one, it was like, well, that was just a waste of, 3 hours of my day. And it was a personal response to one, going into a movie knowing that this is part 1 of 3, guys.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself is arguably problematic. I hate it when series do that. This is why I don't like most fantasy series. Most fantasy series spend, 200,000 words on a story that doesn't end. It just stops. It just stops, basically, to say, and in the next book, we'll pick it up. And it's like, don't do that.
Yeah.
Do
Yeah.
that. And one can
Like it's
argue that Jackson committed the exact same sin with these movies, that
right. Like you can't watch them independently.
Yeah.
You have to watch all three. It's I could see that. That does kind of frustrate one. The thing I find interesting about diehard fans is, on one hand, there are the diehard fans that no matter what is on the screen, they are just so excited to see the characters come to life. They love it. So
Yeah.
like you'll see that with, the Twilight fans or Star Trek or Star Wars, but then
or comics,
or comics,
Yeah.
yes. But then the other diehard fans will never be happy because it's not to the letter, or they've taken what they feel is essential to a character and it wasn't there, and it's really interesting to see because you can't that's the you can't please everyone thing.
Yeah.
I guess.
Well, or they've taken certain liberties. Look, I think one of the reasons that Marvel movies are so successful in the main,
mm-hmm.
and I think there have been some Marvel movies that maybe weren't as successful,
right?
But
generally speaking, they do quite well.
Yeah. But one of the things that they have done brilliantly in the main is they have never lost sight of the core of the characters that are what the fans have loved for so long, and recognizing that, and let's be honest, comic fans are an insignificant percentage of the entertainment populace. All you have to do is look at the numbers, all right? The people who actually buy comics versus the people who say, watch TV or go to the movies is it has to be less than 1%.
Yeah.
Right? But that core fan base who love, for instance, Superman or Wolverine or Captain America or Captain Marvel come to the movies, these stories, looking for the character, not looking for the story. They're looking for the character, right? Because that's the thing they love. They're going to sit there and they would say, well, Black Widow would never do that. Right?
Yes.
And Marvel has done a great job of translating the heart and soul. Evans's Captain America is arguably perfect.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He is absolutely who Captain America should be.
Right.
That essence from the comic is absolutely translated to the screen. You can't look at that and be like, Cap wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
You can't do that. And because they are so faithful about that, they are able to buy a little more maneuver room in other places.
I see.
Which I think is also interesting. I think one of the problems that you get in the main with Warner Brothers is that they don't have faith in their characters. And so they fix them for movies. Mm-hmm. And I say,
yeah,
I'm doing finger quotes.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But, a Superman who's an asshole is not Superman.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. We've talked about that. It's very frustrating to take a beloved character.
But the argument that, the audience won't respond to that. They won't respond. Yeah, it's like, well, God, you know what? The Donner Superman movies are beloved to this day.
Mm-hmm.
So it is interesting to see when people approach these adaptations, what is the appeal? And a lot of the time, I think the pitfall is that they actually think the appeal is the visual.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the equivalent of saying the appeal of the steak is the sizzle. You know what I mean? And it's like, and the sizzle is great, but you can't eat sizzle.
So true.
So it's going to look real good.
Yeah.
But it's going to be hollow, and it's going to taste like cardboard when you're done. It's going to be unsatisfying, and you're going to come away from the meal going, I didn't really eat anything. And I would argue this is one of the reasons why there have been several, Warner Brother DC Entertainment movies that open really big and within a week have dropped from number one in the box office to number 8. And that's because marketing did a great job, and everybody came to see the show.
Yep.
And then everybody who saw the show walked away and said, wow, that was a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. There wasn't any meat on that bone.
Right. Yeah. No, you do leave feeling very empty and just like, wow, we saw a lot of things explode, and that's about it. I mean, and you've written, for instance, a lot of DC characters. Is there one in particular that you have felt that, I guess we go reverse. Which one in particular do they just never kind of get right? Or because there's been so many iterations of Batman, for example, like that from the dawn of time till now. It's like
Batman's actually really easy, at the risk of saying something that's going to outrage people. It is very hard to screw up Batman. Mm-hmm. Like
but they do.
Yes, they do. But you have to have decided to. You kind of have to go in there and lose core, because Batman comes immediately with multiple points of connection and incredible cool. All right. There is so much awesome there. And inherently, you get a great juxtaposition, right? You get the badassery and cool factor of Batman, and you get the immediate release valve of those moments when he has to be Bruce Wayne. And he can make the audience laugh reasonably because we're in on the secret with him, right?
Right.
I thought the Nolan approach to the character, and I remember being very excited, when they were filming Batman Begins, I thought the Nolan approach was really the right approach.
Yeah.
Which was to, approach Batman from the angle that this is Bruce Wayne, right? That when he is in costume, that is Bruce Wayne as he actually is. And that when he's out of costume, that Bruce Wayne is an act. And that with Superman, it's the inverse. That when he is Clark Kent, he is, that's who he really is. Right. Superman is just Clark Kent being able to fully be Clark Kent.
Right.
And yet, my problems with the Nolan Batman movies go to less to portrayal and execution than they reside with an absolute. And this is, I think, this is again the difference between the success in the Marvel movies and in the large part the failure of the DC ones, is that Marvel is not embarrassed by their characters, and DC always seems to be. And as seriously as they take Batman and the Nolan movies also spend an inordinate amount of time apologizing for Batman. I mean, they devote money in the millions of dollars, and as translates to screen minutes, to spending time telling the audience, no, it's okay. We know he's dressed up as a giant bat, guys, but this is real. You know what I mean? And as if anybody, and I've said this multiple times, as if anybody saw the movie not knowing who it was about. Right? But there are these moments in every single, and one could argue all of Batman Begins is about this, is about justifying everything that is Batman. As if, and this is when we get origin stories over and over again, as if to say, we're really sorry. We know he's wearing a costume. It's kind of silly. Just bear with us. We're going to make it work for you. And it's going to be like, okay, fine. If you're going to do that, if you have that little faith in your audience, then that needs to be consistent all the way through. Right? Yeah. If you're going to spend that much time telling me Batman needs to do this in The Dark Knight, then you also need to spend that much time showing me how Joker can do these things. You can't expect me to take on faith Or actually, no, it's the exact opposite. You're saying you do not expect me to suspend my disbelief or take on faith that Batman can do these things. You have to show me every mechanism, every device, and justify it.
Right,
but
right.
Don't do that with Joker. Joker gets the pass
Mm-hmm.
because we don't need it with the bad guy. It's like, no, you either turn into the world entirely or you don't. And it is, and as a result, the movies in the main seem always to be apologizing for what the movies are about.
Yeah.
Justice League may be a great film or a horrible film, but the one thing about that movie I am always going to enjoy is we finally got to see Cavill's Superman smile, which he should have been doing 3 movies
Yeah,
ago.
they made him such a curmudgeon. Like, I'm so
because
I'm dark and brooding all the time.
But
I'm
that
like,
comes
what the
out
heck?
that comes out of a misunderstanding of the character. That comes out of a misunderstanding of heroism. It comes out of distrust of the audience. It comes out of this belief that violent equals serious or gritty equals serious. No, that's absolutely not true. I mean, it's not true. It's again, it's all sizzle. It's like if I paint it black, it's goth. You know what I mean? It's like, no, it isn't. It's just painted black, guys. That's all it is. So I think the closest that they've come clearly was Wonder Woman, and I think that the Wonder Woman movie has enormous problems.
Yeah, we talked about that on a previous podcast as well.
Pull that pin with Kelly Sue and then duck.
Yeah.
Say, so what'd you think of Wonder Woman? And then grab a helmet and hunker down.
I will do that actually one day.
But and she's not wrong.
Right.
And
right.
I think I was blind to a lot of the flaws. And it's not a flaw in the filmmaking or in the performance. It's a flaw from the script stage.
The writing.
Yeah. It comes out of what Jeff and what Alan wrote and a lack of faith in the audience, and weird misogyny.
Yeah, and I think it's because we want them to succeed. Like, we really want to see our beloved Wonder Woman. We really want to see our beloved. So, we try to find the parts that we like, and we just hold on to it, like the No Man's Land scene. That's all I'm going to pretend the movie was.
We do a lot of heavy lifting for the things that we love.
Yes, and we just want it so badly to be good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is there an adaptation though that you can actually say that, like, I do feel that way about the the mini series itself, and there is another book adaptation that I actually feel I wish I had never read the book and only watched the movie, and that is The Princess Bride. I actually did it in the reverse. I watched the movie like 1,000 million times. It's my comfort movie. That and Pride and Prejudice is my comfort movie. And then, I don't know, a few years ago, I go, I don't think I ever really read the book. And I was mortified.
It's
mortified.
A very different book, isn't it?
I was mortified and sad, and I wish I could take it back.
but they're two different things. I mean, this is the key. And remember, Goldman adapted the one to the other.
Yeah.
Right? So Goldman knew that he was doing two different things.
Yes.
And actually, what I think the novel is sort of, it's a very sly, unreliable narrator.
Yes,
like if you read the Princess,
good way to put it.
If you read The Princess Bride as this is absolutely what the fictional William Goldman who is telling you the story believes, then you have missed the point of the book. Right?
Yeah.
And there's a reason none of that is on screen.
Yeah.
There's a reason that the story is not the screen story is not a man's midlife crisis facing disappointment.
Yeah.
The frame of the movie is a grandfather loving his grandson and telling this fairy tale.
Story. Yes.
And so it is a cognitive whiplash.
It is. And I wasn't
and
aware.
the book
Yeah.
and you're like, what?
I was like, what the fuck just happened?
Exactly.
I was so upset. I was like, I was destroyed. I was like, it was really, really bad for me.
I think that's a great example because I think it's fantastic adaptation, right? Because
Yeah.
because it does actually everything we're talking about. It
Yeah.
acknowledges the differences between each work. And it makes something else. I've been talking a lot to Mark Evans, who is the producer on The Old Guard.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know Mark. God, my phone. I am just
so popular.
It's just popping off with news alerts. It's like, yes, I know the world's on fire. You can't tell. Mark came on to the Old Guard in late 2019, or last quarter of 2019. Sorry, 2018. Maybe mid. And I didn't really talk to him much. We didn't really have much of a connection. And it wasn't until I ended up on set and was working on set, and we were doing a lot of rewriting, on set. I think I've talked about this before. People go, oh my God, they had to do rewrites. And it's like, it's the same thing as editing a book, right? Or a story. It's not a bad thing.
Right.
To be making something and to keep trying to go, how can we make it better?
Exactly.
How can we improve it? People cringe. They're like, oh, they had to do reshoots or whatnot. And it's like, what do you mean had to?
That's called part of the movie making process.
Well, and it's frankly a luxury to be able to do it.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
yeah.
But in this case, I was on set and I would be working on different scenes and we'd be having these discussions. And Mark and I have been talking, about once a week for the last, almost as much as you and I have been talking. And one of the things that we were talking about the last time, and I don't disagree with him, is that he asserts that, the changes in the movie from the original graphic novel, like where we ended up with the film, it is a superior story to what the comic story was.
Okay.
And I'm not sure I disagree with him. I think he's right. Which is not to say I am not very proud of the comic. Yeah. I think the comic is a successful story, but the film is a different story. Right. And the evolution and growth of being able to sort of reapproach the material and view it through this different media lens and how we're going to work it has that to me it clearly has been a rewarding process. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, obviously this podcast is really weird because it's going to play after our Old Guard one, but we haven't had our Old Guard conversation, so our audience is going to be like, why aren't you talking more about it? And because technically you would have heard this last week. I am super psyched to see it though, and I keep seeing all the trailers, and those of you who haven't seen it yet, by the time this airs, it is already on Netflix, so get on that. Right. Definitely get on that.
Go and watch.
Yes. So we did have a few weeks ago, probably maybe like a month ago now, one kind of listener question for you that was a little bit left field, and I thought, well, let's see where it goes. Let's see what happens. So it actually comes from our friends over at Paper Asylum, who, of course, is a comic book pop culture store. And, their thing is selling comics and memorabilia and all sorts of cool things. And they shared that DC had officially cut their ties from Diamond Distribution.
Yeah.
In one sense, the fact that there's no longer a monopoly could be good. However, the stores were concerned by doing this, using these two new larger distribution companies, it could end in them being cut out entirely. And maybe they felt kind of this fear that like DC wants to just sell to direct to like Walmart or something and be like, oh, here's all your stuff. If you want it, go get it there. But at that time when the news came out, it was like literally the day before, and our listener was just like, so I mean, what's the take on that? Because
Yeah.
the way it was done for these stores, which you and Fraction, many people have said, are the lifeline to comics,
Yeah.
those comic book stores, those independent bookstores. And we did a full Creators for Comics for support of stores like this, because we really feel like this is the way that most true fans are getting their content.
Yeah.
So they felt a little bit odd about it, especially
I
being
think,
that
shocked and betrayed.
shocked. Yeah, because they also said, no disrespect to anyone, but the president of DC right now is a comic artist and someone coming from like not just some corporate guy, right? And so they're like, what is the decision about? And like, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure I can look. I mean, you're asking me to. All I can offer are opinions. I have no facts here. Or my facts are few and far between. One of the facts is Diamond has a monopoly that is frankly an illegal monopoly that the government decided was not an important one to strike down. All right. Diamond has a lot of problems. All right. And they are systemic problems that have existed for as long as I have been in the industry. So over 20 years, and they have never been addressed. And they're everything from retailers not receiving shipments to things being stolen, to, leveraging their buying power in really uncool ways. I mean, it just goes on and on. If you are a small retailer, Diamond's relationship with you is perhaps self-evidently not as important as it is to, say, a Midtown Comics, right? But the industry, having moved to the direct market, needs every one of these stores. Mm-hmm. So DC saying we're not going to play with Diamond anymore. Mm-hmm. Look, there is a take on this that says, well, that is good because it demands more of Diamond. Mm-hmm. It is potentially really, really bad if it cuts off the retailer. Now, and again, I'm speaking on a very thin ice here. Absolutely, DC wants to get their books into Walmarts. All right. Mm-hmm. Because the more books they sell, the more money Warner Brothers / AT&T makes. And let's remember where this is coming from. It's one thing to look at Jim Lee and say, Jim, you did this. It's another thing to go, Jim works for AT&T now. Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah. He's like in the cog.
Yeah. He has a lot of authority. He's not at the top of that pyramid.
Yeah.
It would be beyond foolish for DC to no longer support the independent retailers. All right? Because that's still where this core audience lives. Mm-hmm. And the trade-off in getting, say, more books, and you're never going to see a Walmart turn 6 aisles into their comics section. It's not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen. The best you're going to get out of this is, maybe they'll rack some trades in the magazine section. We'll have a comic section. And maybe in toys, they'll be moving certain toys. But you're never going to get the specialty store retailer impact.
Yeah.
It is consistently, and I've said this elsewhere, it is the retailers who make these things possible, right? This industry right now, meaning the print comics industry for Marvel and DC, lives on and Image and go down the line, Dark Horse and Oni and everybody else exists because of these retailers. So divorcing from them in such a way that they cannot they cannot maintain that they cannot carry the stock is cutting their own throat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think. I mean, I don't know how this is going to shake out. I can't imagine a shakeout that does not maintain the direct retail connection. I can't. But you're talking to a guy who's kind of, not at DC anymore.
Right.
So
But you're in the industry, you've been
well,
around it, and so
I
someone
think,
said, "Well, why don't you find out what Greg
I
thinks?"
think without question, DC went about it the wrong way.
Okay.
I understand why they did it when they did it, right? DC/AT&T, and this is the other thing. Now that we have moved into this period where Marvel isn't Marvel, Marvel is Disney.
Disney,
DC is DC, DC is AT&T. There's a shareholder question now. All of this stuff is being driven by what was the profit. What was the profit? Well, AT&T is having a really shitty year. They're having a really bad year. So is Disney.
Yeah.
Right? Disney's having a really bad year.
Yeah.
Well, when that happens, bean counters immediately make panic moves. So instead of going, there was a way to do this that was the right way, then there's the way to do this that is the fast way. This was clearly done because somebody was looking at how deep in the red they were and going, we have to change this now. We were talking about it. Now it's got to happen.
Yeah.
And frankly, Diamond's behavior at the start of the pandemic and their treatment towards the retailers probably was a huge trigger to it. But again, I mean, I'm speculating wildly now. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, there was just so much dissonance because it was a really shocking, and I mean, sent it to me. He's like, "Yeah, well, we just got this letter in the mail. I don't know what's going on," and it was just and he was like, "Well, just from a retail perspective, like the management of it is going to be disastrous for them. It just makes it harder, I think, on them too, and they just didn't know what to do." And and like he said, there was tons of criticism for Diamond anyway. He goes, "Oh man, orders were always damaged, things were always a mess." Like there was problems, but they don't know where they stand, and I think there were just like some concerns and question of like, well, does that mean Marvel would follow suit?
Right.
Is it something they think that's going to happen? And I didn't know this, but apparently in the 90s they tried to do something like that, but like bought distributorship and tried to do it on their own or go a different route. But I think that went bankrupt. I'm not sure. So, the question is like now, a big player like that makes a decision. Does the next one follow suit? And what does that mean?
Well, and look, I mean, I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And, there's an iteration of this that may end up with, with our specialty retail stores needing to retool themselves somewhat in where their focuses are. And God, man, I genuinely don't know if this is the start of something or not. I do know that at the end of the day, and we say this all the time, like at the end of the day, this is about AT&T trying to make more money.
Right. I was like, we're going to talk about greed in a minute.
Yeah, but it's true.
It is.
But if that is the truth, right? That they are, they're in this for the money, then it becomes foolish to not continue relationships with people who are selling their goods.
Exactly. And pushing it and like really like passionately and as well. I mean, because the guy at Walmart's certainly not going to help recommend.
You got it. Yeah. And I don't expect somebody, and again, no disdain to Walmart. There are plenty of comics fans who work there.
Right.
But I don't expect there's ever going to be anybody at Walmart that I'm going to walk up to and say, so I'm looking for a new book and I really like, I really like Matt Fraction's Sex Criminals with
Right.
Zdarsky. Can you recommend anything? And them looking at me and saying, you said sex. We don't carry anything with that in it. Never mind that even if they had something, they'd be like, yeah, you can't get it here.
Right.
We don't carry it.
Yes.
And that's the other thing. The second, the trade-off of getting stuff into Walmart, maybe you're going to sell a whole lot more middle-aged Batman stuff, but you're not going to sell any Black Label books.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, it's an interesting trade-off for sure. It was an interesting decision, and when it was brought to my attention, it just hasn't been the right time to bring up the question in the last few conversations. So I said, let me just see what your thoughts were.
And this is, I've got to say, you can discount every single thing I'm saying on this. I have tried to navigate these waters, and I really don't know what the shakeout's going to be on it.
Yeah. We just have to wait and see, I guess.
Yeah, and this is, and I think the insult to injury is that all this came down in the middle of the pandemic. And
exactly. Yeah, that was the thing. The stores are already dealing with so much.
Yeah.
And as a small business owner myself, it's just to be thrown a whole nother, wrench in this wheel of madness was definitely
and
not
without
great
warning
timing. Without warning.
Terrible.
Yeah. So, all right. Well.
Yeah. So next week.
Next week we'll see what happens.
All right.
But again, if everybody hasn't seen it yet, make sure you get on The Old Guard on Netflix and send us your thoughts and send us what you think so that we can hear all about what you want to ask Greg about.
We can do a whole Q&A on that.
A whole Q&A. So start building your questions now. All right. Thank you so much, Greg. As always, it's a pleasure.
As always, thank you, Mimi. Give my best to Oscar. Give my best to Dad.
Will. Thank you. And likewise to Jenna and the kids. And Marlo.
And Marlo. Yes, you cannot forget your number one fan. All right?
My star.
Yes.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to Culture Chat and hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe and rate my podcast. Feel free to leave me suggestions or send an email to mimi@culturechatpodcast.com or follow me on social media at SifuMimiChan on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook.